Good evening. We are live here at School Psych Podcast. I'm really excited tonight. This is another exciting episode for me because I'm all into, the cognitive, the assessments and whatnot. That's a big part of what I do at my job. So very excited. We'll say that our guest, I first was introduced to him through an article that was shared on, I want to say, the School Psychology Forum, and it was a review of the WISC-5, and I was just like, it was so fun to read, which is, I know that's really dorky, but I really enjoyed it, and since then I've been kind of reading more and more of his work. So I'm hoping that I think that this will be a really good episode and really informative. But my name is Rachel. I'm a school psychologist working in the state of Maryland. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to participate tonight. So you can participate in a couple different ways. If you're watching through YouTube, there should be a little chat box to the side. And if you're signed in through your Google or YouTube account, you should be able to post comments and questions there. You can also participate through Twitter using the hashtag psychpodcast, and we'll be on the lookout for that. And then you can also comment on Facebook on the event or on the School Psych Podcast page there as well. And we'll kind of be looking for your questions and comments and just going from there. But Anna's not here tonight just because she had something come up kind of last minute, but she might pop on a little bit later. But I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. Rebecca?
Hello, everybody. I'm Rebecca. I am a school psychologist working in the state of Connecticut, and I'm currently in the state of Connecticut, although some of you who enjoy my window normally behind me will notice I'm in a new location. We had a nor'easter, which took my Wi-Fi out. So I am at a friend's house tonight. I'm really excited to introduce tonight's guest. Dr. Gary L. Canivez is a professor of psychology at Eastern Illinois University, principally involved in the Specialist in School Psychology program. Dr. Canivez is a fellow of the American Psychological Association Division of Quantitative and Qualitative Methods, a charter fellow at the Midwestern Psychological Association, a member of the Society for the Study of School Psychology, and past president of the Arizona Association of School Psychologists. He is an associate editor for the Archives of Scientific Psychology and is an editorial board member for several school psychology and assessment journals. His research interests are in applied psychometrics, in evaluating psychological and educational tests, including international applications, and empirically supported test interpretation. Welcome, Dr. Canivez. We are so grateful and excited to have you here tonight.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys. And I guess at this point, probably the best way to start is, I guess, for me to just make a few brief comments. And I want to sort of emphasize that there is a 99-slide handout that is available. I am obviously not going to be going through all 99 slides. They're sort of supplemental to things that may come up in the conversation. And I'm happy to entertain questions or comments that people might have who are tuning in and sort of live. And then if you guys have questions, feel free to direct me to them. And I'll try to then go through and pick the slides that are most appropriate for illustrating or identifying something that is pertinent.
That would be great.
This presentation is about Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory and its relationship to cognitive tests and the theoretical and practical considerations that sort of come with that. And a lot of what are in the slides are from a symposium paper that I presented at the APA convention in Washington, D.C. last August. And it revolves around aspects about our psychological tests that measure cognitive abilities and the extent to which they may or perhaps may not adequately reflect CHC theory, and even if that theory is, in fact, adequately supported. Let me start off first with, and I'm gonna sort of, it's the second slide. I'll sort of pull that up just because I think it's important for people to sort of know where I come from with regard to sort of presentations wherever I go. And the the one I always start with is this quote from Irving Weiner, and that effective clinicians, A, know what their tests can do, and B, act accordingly. Knowing what one's tests can do, that is what psychological functions they describe accurately, what diagnostic conclusions can be inferred from them, with what degree of certainty, what kinds of behavior they can be expected to predict, is the measure of the psychodiagnostician's competence. Acting accordingly, that is expressing only opinions that are consonant with the current status of validity data, is the measure of his or her ethicality. And I always begin with this because it is something that ultimately is what we're about in our psychological assessments, and that is we seek to do assessments and do research that is in line with ethical standards. And both American Psychological Association and NASP have ethical standards and principles which are concerned with psychological testing, the interpretation of scores from tests, and the requirement that we, in a sense, utilize empirically based information for determining what scores might be interpreted, and to include, caveats about whether, some scores may not have the level of precision that we would like, but perhaps maybe they're the best that we have at the moment, and we sort of we consider those in this process. So everything that I want to talk about tonight, or fielding questions, I always sort of look at it from this kind of perspective, and sort of thinking about, well, what do we know about the measures that we have? How adequately do they perform? And that really gets at an issue of reliability and validity. So questions at this point?
I think, I'm just excited in general. I know that it kind of lines up a lot with Dr. McGill and some of the things that he's kind of talked to us a little bit about. And I think that you guys have done some research together and are kind of on the same page about that. So I think that it folds kind of nicely into that. But yeah, I think that people watching are kind of going to get a little bit of mind blowing as far as, because I know in graduate school, CHC Theory is huge. And I mean, it's huge in our kind of, especially those using some of these programs and LD identification systems based on CHC Theory specifically. So I think it's really important that we know kind of what maybe limitations might be associated with our tests when we're measuring those things. So.
Right. Yeah, and Dr. McGill and I are collaborating on a number of projects, and so I enjoy my my interactions and work with him, and he's doing some outstanding work himself. So toward this end of sort of thinking about our tests and how well they work, and the aspects about training, what I and a number of others have identified is there is a general lack of adequate training in psychological measurement principles and statistics, both at the clinical psychology level as well as school psychology level. And so, of course, that varies from program to program. But the kinds of questions that I see school psychologists raise in various online venues, and when I teach workshops, it is rather unfortunate that the level of understanding of basic psychometrics is, in a sense, inadequate. And I think that we need to do a much better job in both requiring undergraduates and graduate students in terms of courses in psychometrics, so that everybody's able to open up a technical manual and understand what's there, what's not there, what is there and perhaps inaccurate, or perhaps obfuscating. And I've been very critical in my reviews of psychological tests for when I do a Burroughs Institute review, to point out the things that perhaps are not there that ought to be. So, so sort of having sort of that background, a lot of times I end up having to explain in my workshops, why it is that we want to pay attention to different ways of estimating the reliability of the scores that tests provide. why we want to engage in an investigation of lots of different ways of establishing the validity of the scores from tests and the kinds of inferences we might be able to make, the decisions that we might be able to make. And then the more important quality ultimately is the diagnostic accuracy or diagnostic utility, because a test could have acceptable levels of reliability and it can have acceptable levels of validity, which are sort of based on groups. But if at the diagnostic utility level, where we're looking at what the test can do in terms of accurately identifying individuals who might have a disorder, who don't have this disorder, that is in a sense where the ultimate responsibility is in terms of database decision making. And if we don't have an acceptable level of diagnostic accuracy, then although a test may actually have some evidence of its validity, it might not be adequately used in making individual decisions. Mm-hmm. So all of these are in a sense, foundational elements that then impact the decisions that school psychologists have, number one, in selecting a test, number two, deciding what evidence is there in the technical manual and the extant literature that provides the justification for the kinds of things I might infer from the results. And that is all based on the validity research. And so all of these things are sort of tied together. And we need to be very mindful that when we look at a technical manual, when we look at the promotional materials, when we, in a sense, have a workshop put on by a representative from the test company, we never really see any negative research results. And it's very disappointing because actually one of the first things that Oscar Peirce wrote in like 1938 was that, in a sense, people who use tests have a right to full disclosure of all the particulars about a test. And since the 1930s, we still don't have full disclosure about things in technical manuals. And so when I write an article that evaluates the reliability or validity of a test, I always go back and say, well, what were the things that were adequate or adequately reported, and then maybe where there's some problems. And so I know that certainly with the WIS-5 and the WJ-4, either I as a lead author or as a secondary author, we've identified some pretty major shortcomings in terms of procedures that were used, results that were reported that actually are not supported by independent examination of the standardization sample data. And so I have some slides that we can sort of go to that illustrate some of these kinds of things. So, but ultimately the responsibility is for the examiner, for the school psychologist to, in a sense, make a determination about what scores or comparisons actually meet the standards for sufficient reliability and validity and diagnostic utility to be used with this individual kid. So I'll take a pause here in case a question has come up, and I can address that immediately or move forward.
Yeah, I have a thought or a question. And I totally get what you're saying about, we need to, as school psychologists, be educated and know kind of the shortcomings of the tests that we're using. I think that as a practitioner, it's especially hard because, we don't have the level of knowledge of stats and expertise that you as a researcher have. And so most of the time as practitioners, we open up the test manual and it says, oh, this is an awesome test. And look at this reliability. And we don't know enough about stats or about measurement to say, oh, they didn't look at it this way, or they didn't use this type of analysis. And so it's really hard. And so is it test companies, is it money? They don't want to talk negatively about themselves? Why are they omitting some of these things that, in your opinion, are relevant and that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I wish I knew, what the reason was for key pieces of information not to be in technical manuals any longer, or why practices that that may be deceptive, or at least models that might be presented that actually, if the analysis done in the appropriate way, turn out not to work, then you have to sort of wonder, well, why is that? And my concern is for school psychologists, and it's not just school psychologists. The workshop that I do at APA and other venues, It's a workshop called Ethics, Test Standards, and Test Interpretation, Measurement Matters. And it reviews all of the measurement principles that are the foundations for deciding what scores or comparisons can be interpreted, and then using exemplars from the literature and pointing out, well, here's what a test manual might say, and here's what the peer-reviewed literature has to say about the very same data. And there can be just wildly different results. And so in presenting those elements in terms of, well, perhaps, the procedure that was used is maybe not optimal. Maybe it's a non-standard procedure. Maybe there were things that were done behind the scenes to make the model work, but that's no longer confirmatory. And so if that's the case, then in a sense, and then the people in the workshop will often go, well, how do they get away with, not presenting the correct information or the full particulars, as Burroughs would have said. And I say, well, then it's really up to the buyer. It's up to this professional to, in a sense, evaluate that. Or in the case of, if you look at the Mental Measurements Yearbook reviews, some reviewers are pretty critical about maybe missing information or information that is based on non-standard methods and so on. But the ultimate problem is related to how little measurement and applied statistics training school psychologists and clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists and industrial organizational psychologists and forensic psychologists and neuropsychologists. Everybody is really in the same boat with that. There's so little emphasis on the most fundamental aspect of training in terms of being able to competently evaluate the tests that we use. And so that's my workshop, is really trying to sensitize people to, here are the things that we need to pay attention to. And you may not have gotten this in your training program, or maybe it's been some time since you've had this, and here's maybe a refresher, but we have to be mindful of this every time we consider what test to use and what scores we should interpret.
Mm-hmm. As you're listing off all those different kind of subfields and whatnot, that they're having the same problem as school psychology, and that kind of makes me feel better, but at the same time not. Like, it's not good that everybody has the same problem, but at least it's not just school psychologists that are.
No, it's not, and in fact, and it's not a problem just in the United States. It's a worldwide problem, because every 2 years when the International Test Commission meets, and I attend, we all lament the same thing, and that is, at the undergraduate level, everybody has to have a basic introductory statistics class. That is universal. It is worldwide. Everybody gets intro stats. Everybody has to have a research methods or experimental design course. That's universal. That's worldwide. Everybody understands that. But almost nowhere is there ever a requirement that psychological measurement be in a sense, that third scientific foundation for the discipline, the scientific elements of psychology. And so that element is, in a sense, missing from the undergraduate curriculum in most places. And I can't even convince my own university to make that a required course in our major. So every year I say, we really need to have this as a required class. But in a sense, they say, well, it's an elective. Well, when you say it's an elective, you're saying this is not as important as these other things that are required.
You know what might be interesting, when we were talking as before we went live, one of the things we said that is so frustrating is that for a school psychologist to defend a dissertation, some of these stats that are coming out from the some of the measurements coming from the test producers wouldn't pass a dissertation panel. What if we thought about, rather than teaching us to well, I mean, I think the required course is a good idea as well, but rather than focusing on the student who then has to be very critical and figure out which tests are valid, what if the test producers had to go before a dissertation committee in order to publish valid work, things that measure what they actually say, and things that can be used in the way that policy dictates.
No, I agree. There are some countries in the world where literally, if you want to sell a test, in that country, they will evaluate it, and you have to document that in fact it works as is stated, or they might not certify your test for use in a particular country. We don't have that. The sort of free market place of sort of the West here is kind of like, well, may the buyer beware, and therein lies part of the problem. But ethics dictate that it's the individual practitioner who is responsible for the selection of the test and for proper interpretation of the scores that come from that test. And that means being knowledgeable about the psychometric fitness of the test and keeping aware of what the recent published literature is about the test. And so what I like to do is to really look at that element to say, what aspects of the test work well, what is there evidence for, and then if there are shortcomings, then I'd like to point that out. And I'm very direct about that in my publications and book chapters that I write, because I want people to sort of know that if there are some practices that are going on in terms of what the technical manual is reporting that are really not best practices or even reasonable practices, I'm going to intentionally point that out to draw attention to that in the introduction section or the method section of the article. So it's an ongoing problem. It's not something new, but it is a problem.
And it seems like across tests, this is a problem, right? Or are there, as far as our cognitive measures, are there some tests that are a lot worse offenders than others? Are there some that we should stay away from, or are they all kind of similarly flawed?
Well, I think that there are problems with most of them in the context of the interpretation part, and that is, on the one hand, they want to have a test that's relatively brief so that you're not spending 8 hours with the kid in terms of measuring just their cognitive abilities. But at the same time, if you have a limited number of subtests, then we're probably not able to really measure all the different facets that people like to claim exist within intelligence with any degree of precision. And so it's sort of a catch-22. If you want to measure more and more and more different facets, it's going to require giving lots and lots and lots of subtests to the same individual in order to sort of get at that. But then you make the testing process so onerous that the kid hates you as soon as they see you coming down the hall. Well, that's not good either. So so there is this sort of dilemma of precision of measuring these sort of smaller units versus measuring something that's maybe more broad. And so I don't think that the test is going to be able to have it both ways. Either it's going to be really super comprehensive and we measure, we use lots and lots of subtests to get at one particular facet, or we sort of utilize the sort of approach where we're more efficient and we sort of estimate the general thing and move on from there. So I think part of this is, and this is sort of leading into this sort of discussion that we were going to have tonight related to, CHC theory, both the theory and the practical elements, because that's part and parcel of sort of the what's happening with intelligence tests. That is ever since the first Binet and Simon scales, and then the Stanford-Binet, and then the Wechsler scales, and so on. There has sort of been an approach to having multiple indicators that would sort of measure these general abilities, but then people trying to make interpretations that go beyond the sort of overall global score, and trying to look at things like patterns of strengths and weaknesses or profile kinds of analyses that sort of have been going on since the 1930s or so. So and so it's, in a sense, all of the contemporary tests of intelligence today either directly or indirectly claim to measure or be aligned with this so-called Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory. And whether they were either revised or further development to look at these things, it does impact the kinds of score interpretations by, in a sense, having more scores to interpret, more factors that might be claimed to be measured. And so while the major test companies have sort of gone in this direction of adopting or having this alignment with this CHC theory, originally CHC was really created to be a taxonomy for classifying subtests into sort of different broad categories or factors. And now it's commonly referred to in many instances as a theory of cognitive abilities, although Kevin McGrew has still even recently refers to it as sort of a model. And so there's an aspect of where the test companies are sort of looking at this sort of overarching approach or taxonomy, if you will, to cover more and more of these CHC broad abilities. I think the present version of CHC, the current iteration now, is upwards of 18 different broad factors, including now an additional thing like emotional intelligence and kinesthetic intelligence and olfactory abilities, and some other kinds of things that may be interesting, but I'm kind of skeptical as to what extent these are cognitive elements, and perhaps to what extent they're going to really inform practice. But so there's a theoretical side, and then there's the practical side, and they do overlap to some extent. But historically, most intelligence tests have this rather considerable complexity in terms of interpretation. And generally speaking, coming from publishers and authors and sort of clinical guidebook folks, they're more likely to be a de-emphasizing of the overall global, full-scale, overall IQ score in favor of interpreting or making sense out of the broad factors, or even at the subtest level, in terms of, well, they were high in this, they were low in that, here's a strength, here's a weakness, that means something. And although there might be some interpretive cachet to that in terms of the sort of clinical approach, the empirical evidence would show that a lot of those things just simply have never worked out. And that's a problem, because if those patterns of strengths and weaknesses are not sufficiently reliable, then they can't be informative. If something's not sufficiently reliable, it's not going to be valid, and then it can't be diagnostically useful. So I think all these things are sort of built upon one another. In terms of theory, what's rather interesting is John Horn, rather famously noted that his extended theory of fluid and crystallized cognitive abilities is wrong, and that all scientific theory is wrong, and that's in a sense true. I mean, all of our theories are in a sense ultimately wrong. It's just that maybe some theories are more wrong than others, and we probably want to go with the one that's least wrong in the great scheme of things. But the sort of that's sort of what we're trying to get at in sort of understanding what the cognitive abilities are. How can they help us to understand what might be going on, and to that extent, what do we measure with any degree of precision that we could be really confident in that score that we got is really reflective of that particular ability. And therein lies part of the problem, because all of those broad abilities have multiple sources of variability in them. Some of the variability in those scores are actually general intelligence, but it's conflated with what's unique to the particular broad ability. So if we take something like, verbal abilities or crystallized abilities, then a part of that score at the broad level, or at the factor score level, some of that variance is actually general intelligence that isn't yet removed. Now, for individuals, you can't really remove that, but we can in group research. And when we do, a lot of the broad factor scores really have a lot of general intelligence variance in there. And when it's removed, there's not a lot left over. And when there's not a lot left over, it doesn't allow one to have the incremental prediction. So if you're looking at, let's say, crystallized ability score or verbal ability score as predicting academic achievement, well, part of that score is really general intelligence. How do you know that score is real? It's the verbal ability that's predicting it, as opposed to general intelligence predicting it. And that's why that's one of the reasons why a research approach to separate those sources out and see, well, how much of the achievement is general intelligence, how much of it is uniquely one of these broad factors. And so that's part of what part of the research that I do and a number of others to sort of ferret that out and try to understand, well, when we're talking about these scores, where is the interpretive power coming from?
Yeah.
So one of the questions that comes up is, in a sense, where did CHC theory come from? And in a sense, it sort of evolved over some time, right around the time of the Woodcock-Johnson revised. And in a sense, CHC is sort of a combination or a marriage of Horn and Cattell's GFGC theory, and Horn's extended GFGC theory, and that of John Carroll's three-stratum theory. And those two theories do have some similarities to them. And so the similarities, and it's probably a good idea for me to kind of go to some of the slides that are uploaded. And so the slide that deals with the Horn-Cattell extended theory, I'm going to try and toggle over to that application window. And so if we look at the Horn and Cattell extended GFGC theory, Horn and Knoll in 1997 and Horn and Blankson in 2005 sort of articulated these aspects. And what you can see is that there are a number of indicators within each of the different broad areas. So GC is the sort of acculturation, knowledge, crystallized abilities.
Can I interrupt you for a second? I think that we're seeing the slides smaller because I think that maybe you have the window restricted.
Yep. I will make that.
Yeah, that's getting bigger. Awesome.
Is that better? You want it bigger than that?
Better. It's still hard to read some of the little. I think that's good. I mean, I'm good, but we'll ask our viewers. But yeah, that looks good. Sorry.
So, what this is sort of an illustration of what John Horn really sort of articulated in the context of sort of the theory, and that is the extension of GF and GC, which ultimately was originally the crystallized versus fluid reasoning. But now it's sort of been extended to the short-term memory, long-term memory, processing speed, and so on. And that each of these different broad dimensions are measured or illustrated by the different indicators below. But what isn't in the Horn and Horn-Cattell model is, in a sense, a general intelligence sort of dimension. This is very much like Louis Thurstone's primary mental abilities. So back at the University of Chicago, Thurstone had his Chicago test of primary mental abilities. He really sort of looked at the structure of his test as sort of being these 7 primary and at the time orthogonal or uncorrelated dimensions. Well, it turns out that Thurstone's 7 primary mental abilities were not uncorrelated. They really were correlated. And so if they're correlated, then there's unmodeled variance that's there that we sort of need to account for. So Cattell and Horn, or the Horn-Cattell approach, and the extended Horn-Cattell theory sort of does not really include a general intelligence dimension in the same way that John Carroll did. And so this is an illustration of John Carroll's three-stratum theory that he wrote about in his book, Human Cognitive Abilities, in 1993. And then there have been some additional book chapters that have come since that time. And what Carroll did was he went back and reanalyzed hundreds of data sets that had been around to try to use the same procedure with all of these different tests and see what would emerge. And his three-stratum theory basically has sort of 3 different levels. On the one level, or stratum 1, are the subtest indicators. These would be the subtests that would be within a particular intelligence test. These are sort of the observable things that we ask a kid to do. And then at the second stratum level are these broad abilities. Fluid intelligence is one. And so there's, so fluid intelligence in the Carroll's three-stratum theory is, the fluid intelligence or fluid reasoning from the Horn-Cattell approach. Crystallized intelligence, we see that that's a similar dimension. And so what happens is that Carroll and Horn's, stratum 1 and stratum 2, there is some resemblance of these sort of two theories. But what Carroll included in his model was this third stratum, and the third stratum is general intelligence. Now, the illustration that I have here is sort of the common illustration for Carroll's theory, but this is probably not a good representation of what Carroll really meant. And the next slide is a better representation that Alex Beaujean at Baylor University wrote about 2015, and that Beaujean argued and presented information that suggested Carroll's view was more of what's called a bifactor model rather than a higher order model of general intelligence. And so this is a better representation. You can see that the subtest indicators in the middle, they're the same indicators. But notice that on the one hand, at the top of this graph is general intelligence. And general intelligence impacts every one of these broad area, every one of these specific observable indicators directly. In a higher order model, which is sort of this other version, you can see that the general intelligence has a path going directly to the broad factor, and the broad factor then goes down to the subtest indicators. This higher order model makes general intelligence be fully mediated by the broad factors in order to influence the subtests. And that's a different conceptualization of what general intelligence is, as opposed to the bifactor approach, which is general intelligence directly influences the subtest indicators at the same time that the broad factors are also simultaneously influencing those subtest indicators. And so it's a different way of thinking about general intelligence. And these are different ways of thinking about general intelligence. They in a sense, are in a sense different theoretical points of view. This model, the bifactor model, does appear to be what we consider to be maybe more parsimonious, in a sense that you only have one level of inference. So if you do really well with quantitative reasoning, or you do really well with sequential reasoning, then I can directly infer you're pretty good with general intelligence, and you're also pretty good with fluid intelligence, in a sense that the inferences of something more general and something more specific are simultaneous. The higher order model requires that general intelligence be mediated by the different broad factors to influence the subtests. And so this is a more complicated model, because in order to get to general intelligence, there's an inference of the subtest indicator. If you do well there, we infer something about the broad factor. The fact that the broad factors are correlated, then those correlations are what we infer is general intelligence. So in a sense, general intelligence would be an inference from inferences. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So in a sense, the bifactor model just allows general intelligence to be directly inferred from the subtest indicators, rather than general intelligence as an inference from the inferences that we make from those indicators. It's sort of another step removed. So in a sense, if you look at the Horn and Cattell approach, there's no G, there's no general intelligence there. You just got the broad factors. And if you go to Carroll's model, which ostensibly is a bifactor model, it does have general intelligence. Then those are not compatible. Mm. They're compatible at the subtest indicator and the broad factors. But the fact that Carroll provided lots of evidence that the measures that he analyzed were maybe mostly general intelligence, with a little bit of variability in the broad factors. And so leaving general intelligence out of a model is very different than if you have a model with it in. And so this is one of the concerns that I have, and I've commented on in my workshops and in other situations, and that is, you know, Horn and Cattell, and John Horn later on basically was not considering general intelligence, and John Carroll was. And so if you put those two theories together into one CHC theory, I think that you're putting two incompatible approaches into one approach. And so this marriage of Horn and Cattell with John Carroll, it makes for very strange bedfellows. I just don't see how those two folks can get along with one another in the same theoretical model, even though the subtests and the broad factors do have some kind of sort of alignment. And so I would argue, and I sort of mentioned this at in the symposium, is that, you know, I think that this was a marriage that was put together without the two parties actually, you know, agreeing that this is a really good thing. So I'm calling for an annulment of the Horn, Cattell, and John Carroll sort of CHC model, because I don't think that they really can sort of peacefully coexist. And in fact, Carroll's last writings in 2003, on the very last pages of the chapter, yeah, I have a slide later on in the toward the very end. I'm going to try to scroll down and
I do remember, speaking back to graduate school, I remember a professor commenting that they don't really agree, but they kind of made it work somehow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so in a sense, you know, so this is the slide, you know, toward the very end where I'm talking about conclusions, and so I've sort of jumped ahead a little bit here. But so the Horn-Cattell approach sort of denies general intelligence, and it differs from Carroll, who, in a sense, really provided evidence that cognitive tests were primarily general intelligence with some additional broad factors measured, but it makes for a strange combination. So do you need the Cattell-Horn part if Carroll's model already accounts for the broad abilities and the indicators, but also includes general intelligence? In a sense, Cassina and Howardson argue that Carroll is really they would argue that Carroll is right. We don't need the Cattell-Horn model at all. And in fact, Carroll himself was skeptical about this sort of CHC thing, because what's in the slide is McGrew and Woodcock. So what Carroll wrote on page 18 of this chapter, McGrew and Woodcock introduced a so-called CHC, Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of cognitive abilities that supplemented Horn's GFGC theory with essentially a three-stratum theory. And even though I was to some extent involved in this change as an occasional consultant to the authors and publishers, I'm still not quite sure what caused or motivated it. So Carroll's very skeptical, I think, about this sort of, why do we need CHC? Because I already talk about the three-stratum, and if Horn and Cattell don't want to have the general intelligence, well, then that's different. That's a different model. And so, you know, Carroll goes on and says, you know, Horn's comments suggest he conveniently forgets a fundamental principle on which factor analysis is based, a principle of which he's undoubtedly aware, that the nature of a single factor discovered to account for a table of intercorrelations does not necessarily relate to special characteristics of the variables involved in the correlation matrix. Relates only to characteristics or underlying measurements, latent variables that are common to these variables. I cannot regard Horn's comment as sound basis for denying the existence of factor G, yet he has succeeded in persuading himself and many others to do exactly this for an extended period of years. So in a sense, Carroll's saying, I don't know that I want to have any part of the CHC thing here. He doesn't look at the world quite the same way. So based on Carroll's arguments and comments and theoretical differences, I think it's time to grant an annulment to, in a sense, their theory's marriage. I don't know that really, if you got Carroll and Horn in the same room and hashed it all out, that they would necessarily come to this agreement and say, yeah, we look at the world exactly the same way. We should be all together here.
That's so funny, and it brings me back to some of the contentious arguments and things that we see on Facebook groups. That it seems like psychs are having these arguments, just not on Facebook, but right, just some of the quotes that you're reading, kind of in my mind is these, going back and forth type of thing.
Yeah, and so and now, admittedly, these are sort of theoretical sort of arguments, and theory is useful, theory is good. We sort of want to have this sort of understanding, and theory can help us, to guide the kinds of things we want to pay attention to, and there are assumptions and all of that. But ultimately, we have to sort of measure these things, and therein lies sort of the practical components. And so on the theoretical side, Horn and Cattell and the Carroll parts, they don't necessarily mesh as nicely as the CHC approach might suggest. That's sort of on the theoretical side. Maybe they're both wrong. They're probably both wrong, but at this point in time, the empirical evidence really points in the direction that almost all of our intelligence tests fundamentally measure general intelligence, including the Woodcock-Johnson 4 and the 3, which is supposed to be the reference instrument for CHC. So herein lies a bit of an issue, because if you look at actual analysis of the WJ4, something that Stefan Dombrowski and Ryan McGill and I published an EFA paper on, and recently a confirmatory factor analysis paper on, and both of them converging in, quite nicely in terms of a theoretical, a structure that actually doesn't fit the 7 factors that are proposed in the technical manual. And so this becomes a bit of a problem, because, and the same thing happened with the Wechsler scales with the WISC-5. If you try to extract 5 factors, it just doesn't work. And it doesn't matter. And so part of the problem then is that the practical aspect of measuring these things with any degree of reliability and structure that actually fits, there are problems. So let me go back at the very top of, well, not the very top, but higher up in the slides, where it talks about the sort of CHC model, sort of where it comes from, and what the get back to the screen share. There we go.
As you're looking for the slide, may I jump in and with just a question and a thought?
Sure.
One of our commenters pointed out that a takeaway point is that G better predicts tier 2 abilities better than the components. So he says on the WISC-5, he points out that G predicts the GF, GC, et cetera, better than the actual subtests of GF, GC. So if that's true, and we do grant this annulment, can we then still use G to determine what we're going to do, even if it's at tier 2, maybe not tier 3, and then also, can what we know about the indices, can we develop that in order to make those more predictable and more valid measures of something that we're looking for to qualify kids for supports?
I think that the aspect of sort of where G is in the I guess the 3-stratum model, the way it's sort of presented, it's sort of this, it's illustrated most often as a sort of 3rd tier, sort of like in that hierarchy. And Spearman's and Carroll sort of looked at this aspect of general intelligence, I believe, from more of a Spearman approach. That is, that there's something common among all the different tasks that we might ask somebody to do, and that the fact that general intelligence is involved in all of the things that we would do in terms of reasoning and problem solving and decision making and memory and all these other things that we look at as sort of separate things, but general intelligence is sort of involved in all of that. And so maybe it probably is more of a tier 2 aspect, and that really 3 stratum is really, well, there's sort of the G stratum, and then there's the broad factor stratum with the subtest indicators at stratum 1. But stratum 2 would be part of it is sort of a broad general ability, and some of it is more specific aspects. And so if you want to measure those more specific broad factors, you're going to have to add a lot of subtests to capture that variance, I think. But I think that the problem then is that you have to add so many subtests in order to capture that variability that it becomes an impossible task to actually practically give a test that would include all of those. Or perhaps you have to select tasks that are not so oriented towards general intelligence. And we haven't been able, I don't think we've been able to figure out how to do that. And you can't have your cake and eat it too. You're going to have some, you have tasks that are really good at measuring general intelligence. Well, then they're not going to measure the broad factors so well. And if you have something that measures the broad factor really well, then it's not going to measure general intelligence very well. So the good example of that comes from the so-called processing speed factor. So I'm actually going to go to the slide that actually looks at the WISC 5. If I can get there, where is it? All right. So this would so here is the WISC 5 in terms of the exploratory factor analysis and the problems of 5 factors. The 5th factor is basically measured only by figure weights when you do an exploratory analysis. So you don't define a factor by one subtest indicator. But if you look at what sort of happens here, you've got matrix reasoning and figure weights and picture concepts, which are mostly general intelligence. The dark green is sort of general intelligence, and the light green is the broad factor or the sort of factor index sort of level, the broad ability. And so when you look at matrix reasoning and figure weights and picture concepts, those are almost all general intelligence and not very much anything else. But look over here, whoops. If you look over at the coding, symbol search, and cancellation subtests, there's very little general intelligence captured and a whole lot more broad ability captured. What that's referring to is the fact that these tasks, coding, symbol search, and cancellation, measure something more specific among themselves and not related to general intelligence. Well, we've known that coding, symbol search, and cancellation are not good measures of general intelligence. That's obvious. And so in order to sort of have a task that measures something more specific, it has to have probably maybe less G variance. And I don't know that we've been able to very well separate those things out. We're probably measuring either more G variance or less and less broad abilities, variability. And so that's sort of part of the issue when we're sort of looking at what the tasks are measuring. So similarities, well, it's part general intelligence and it's part whatever vocabulary or whatever similarities is. Vocabulary is part G and part defining vocabulary words. So in a sense, these variance sources are coming from 2 different places. And Carroll was very adamant about this in his approach, saying that we need to be able to, in a sense, look at how much variance is captured within the subtest, how much of it's general, how much of it is the broad ability, and we need to keep that in mind. And if the test is mostly measuring general intelligence, we may not be able to make the kinds of inferences from the broad areas. And where that kind of comes in, and here's the slide that sort of says, okay, this would be the Schmid and Lehman mathematical procedure that Carroll insisted on for dividing up that variance. How much of the subtest is due to general intelligence? How much of it remains in the broad factor? And so the coefficients that are listed here, omegas, these are reliability coefficients of sorts. They tell you the proportion of true score variance if you were to make a composite score of these indicators. So if you looked at all 16 subtests from the WISC 5, a composite score made up of those 16 would give you 83.3% true score variance captured. that's sizable. That's a really nice, robust amount of sort of variability to deal with and to interpret. Unfortunately, verbal comprehension and working memory and perceptual reasoning, if you look at those omega coefficients, 0.216 for verbal comprehension, that's using all 4 verbal comprehension subtests. Once you take general intelligence out of those tasks, what you have left is very little true score variance left. And that's why you end up with problems of interpretation, because the verbal comprehension index score that you get from the manual is general intelligence variance plus verbal comprehension variance. And so they're conflated. So the power of verbal comprehension index may very well be because of how much general intelligence is there. If you take the general intelligence out, you get very little unique contribution of verbal comprehension by itself. You get less with working memory and even less with perceptual reasoning. The only one that has a marginal amount of unique variance captured is the so-called processing speed index. And that processing speed, gets to about a coefficient of 0.505, which just meets the threshold for sort of possible interpretation. But again, what's processing speed going to do for you? I don't know that it really helps us very much in understanding, the kids', acquisition of reading, math, or whatever.
Wow.
I'm just looking at those numbers, and it's very telling. And I'm thinking about like the structure of the WISC and the structure of some of our, like comparing the DOS that doesn't kind of fold the processing speed into like that overall GCA versus the WISC that does, but at the same time, it's not using the 2 processing speed subtests. It's just taking the 1. So is that kind of why that's not as heavily weighted, because it's not as much G? It's actually one of the ones that might be a little bit more actually what it should be measuring.
Yeah, one of the problems that happened with the WISC 4 was that they sort of had 2 working memory and 2 so-called processing speed subtests that were in with the full scale IQ, and then they realized, oh well, wait, that's going to be a problem. So then they created the general ability index. So the general ability index and the and then you had the other 4 subtests. So you had create the cognitive proficiency index too. So we have more scores to interpret, but not necessarily, all that useful perhaps. But in a sense, the general ability index was necessary because individuals who might have difficulties with working memory or difficulties with, the processing speed tasks, that would, in a sense, negatively influence the full scale IQ. And so if you wanted to sort of have a general ability index, then just stick with the verbal and the perceptual tasks, and you're going to have a much better estimate under those conditions. So that I think that's part of it. I think the WISC-5 is certainly much less influenced by that, simply because the full scale score now is just 7 subtests and not so heavily influenced by working memory or the processing speed tasks. The problem though with the WISC-5 is that when you look at the sort of CHC factors, right? So Pearson wanted to, in a sense, have a more CHC oriented test. So they wanted to split the former perceptual reasoning test into visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning. Well, it turns out that the attempt to do that really wasn't very successful. That, in a sense, if you try to take 5 factors, you only get figure weights that actually contributes to that 5th factor when you look at the entire standardization sample analyses. And what happens is that it strips variance away from other places, and so you end up with a situation where you get, for example, picture concepts doesn't load on anything, so that's one problem. But then in a 5-factor representation, it turns out that matrix reasoning doesn't have a salient loading on any factor if you take 5 factors. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Matrix reasoning is a fantastic subtest. But if you're trying to spread the variance across 5 different factors, it's got to get variance from somewhere. So it's probably shifting some of that from matrix reasoning. So that's why when we intentionally said, well, let's extract 5, let's see what happens, and it really didn't work very well. So when we said, well, let's take 4 factors, now you get this really nice match to what was formerly thought of as the structure from the WISC-4. And I'm going to try and toggle back to the application window. So here is the results for the WISC-5, where you end up with the nice division of, similarities, vocabulary, information comprehension, and verbal comprehension. You get the 4 perceptual reasoning, or you might call that visual space, whatever you want to call that. It's a merger of block design, visual puzzles, matrix reasoning, and figure weights, and that's a nice, robust sort of factor. And you don't get cross-loading, so you don't end up with subtests that are in multiple places. And so this, basically the WISC-5 looks a whole lot like the WISC-4, and you kind of have to, the attempt to separate visual, spatial, and fluid reasoning just didn't quite work out. And whether you do it with exploratory or you look at confirmatory factor analysis, it's the same thing.
Oh goodness, my brain is struggling to keep up.
Well, I think we have a really maybe practical question from Anna. How much testing do you think one should really be doing, given all this information? Yeah, do you think we should use less tests?
I think that we need to be selective and mindful of what do the most comprehensive tests of ours actually measure with any degree of certainty, and would we, in a sense, do we get value added from all that time, all that assessment time? So we didn't go through it, but some of the slides later on show that the factor index scores do not add appreciable amounts of variance to predicting achievement or explaining achievement beyond general intelligence. And that's the foundation of that, is the fact that the broad factors don't have enough unique measurement by themselves. So once the G variance is removed, they don't really give you a whole lot of added variance predicted. What does predict incrementally, though, is a little bit of GC, or the crystallized abilities. That does give some value added, although not very large in most instances, but sometimes a decent amount. But apart from that, if you're looking at interpreting strengths and weaknesses in terms of CHC areas, and so there are a number of approaches that are suggested in terms of processing strengths and weaknesses, where you're looking, well, this factor score was high, this one was low. There's a pattern of strengths and weaknesses there. Therefore, we can consider this kid as having a learning disability. The problem with that is, whether it's at the subtest level or even the factor index level, is that those differences, the strengths and weaknesses from time, if you do that today and you do it 2 or 3 years from now, those indexes or those differences operate pretty much at chance. So what was a strength today won't be a strength 2 or 3 years from now. What was a weakness might not be. And so there are too many people where the instability means that, well, how do we know that the strength and weakness today is really an honest strength or a weakness? If it's not stable over time, Cronbach and Snow said, if it's not stable over time, you can't really do very much with that index. And so then it becomes problematic. And if we try to use those strengths and weaknesses to make accurate predictions of who has a learning disability or not, then those are operating at chance levels too, or the positive predictive power is really the main problem. That is that you can't use them for ruling in. And so John Kranzler's work in this area is showing that those processing strengths and weaknesses are really not operating well to tell us who has a learning disability, who does not. So given those kinds of things, that you don't have the incremental validity, you don't have diagnostic utility, the amount of variability captured by the CHC broad factors is rather minimal once G is removed, then what we really measure with most of our tests is just simply general intelligence. We measure general intelligence really, really well. But we don't measure much else other than that very well. And therefore, we probably would be more efficient by just giving a test that measured general intelligence rather efficiently. So something like the RIAS, 2 verbal, 2 nonverbal subtests, 20, 30 minutes, you've got a good estimate of general intelligence. Now, take that other time that you would be giving all these extra tests to come up with processing strengths and weaknesses that really are not sufficiently stable over time, not reliable. You probably would be using your time more wisely, looking at more direct measures of what the kid can do, what have they mastered academically. That's going to drive where your instructions are. Because there isn't anything from the strengths and weaknesses that are going to tell you what to do with the kid. We don't have differential treatments or interventions that are a result of these different strengths and weaknesses. So I would say probably give a measure that's 4 subtests or so, measure general intelligence. You get a rough indication that, well, this kid's cognitive abilities are kind of in the range where we'd expect some adequate performance, and spend the time measuring other elements.
Wow.
Cool. The chat has been sorry, I'm getting an echo. Hold on. The chat has been kind of wild with lots of people making really great comments, and you've got some fellow researchers on here kind of answering some questions too as they come before they get passed to you. And so I'm asking if anybody has some final questions or anything. We want to be respectful of time, but really good kind of discussions. Let's see.
Oh, I saw one here. It says, Thomas Barnes, so how do the PSW theorists justify the approach given the variance problems you pointed out? And so this is part of the problem. They sort of dance around it. They don't talk about it. They don't really address that sort of major problem. And that's part of the issue too, because if you only look at the broad factor scores, those conflate the general intelligence with the broad factor variance. And because they're conflated, you just don't know how much of that score is due to general intelligence versus the broad factor. And so what you think might be a low or high score may not really be what you think it is. It's a more complex approach to sort of trying to figure out what it is. And a lot of times they recommend, well, just use your clinical judgment. And therein lies part of the problem, because when you see a pattern, then you're so susceptible to confirmatory bias and illusory correlations that you immediately see, oh, well, I've seen that pattern before. And yet it may not actually be a true relationship. And so clinical judgment is really not often very good. We're not usually consistent with ourselves, and we're not consistent between examiners. So yeah, I would lean against the sort of clinical judgment part to the greatest extent possible.
Yeah, and I find myself doing that too when I see profile scores. I'm kind of looking at them and justifying it somehow. Oh, well, this must have happened because of this, and this must have happened because of this, and I kind of rationalize it, and okay, that makes sense. Moving on, but not good.
Yeah, so there are a lot more unanswered questions in that regard. Those that are promoting the processing strengths and weaknesses part, they like to go to and say, well, this is consistent with what IDEA definition for a learning disability is. But even going back to the very first iterations of IDEA, when John Canivez wrote to the government asking about, do you need to document the processing strength or weakness? And Sarge Kennedy wrote back to him and said, no, you do not need to document a severe a strength or a weakness in processing disorder. You must demonstrate or document the discrepancy between ability and achievement. That's back when they said that you had to have a severe discrepancy. But really, processing strengths and weaknesses are more discrepancy assessments, but multiplied by the number of comparisons that you're making. So it's even, it's actually, more problematic than the original achievement ability discrepancy. So I don't really see, until somebody shows or documents that the PSW thing actually is sufficiently reliable, that it's valid, and it's diagnostically useful, it ought not be used. I mean, that's, I think that needs to be a priori. I don't think that we say, well, here's an interesting approach, let's use this until somebody shows that it doesn't work. Science requires that we come up with something with a priori evidence first, and then we sell it and promote it and market it and use it. That has never been demonstrated. And so I think that that's a problem for practitioners because it's intuitive. It sounds good, but the raw psychometrics of our tests probably don't result in that being a reliable valid method.
Mm-hmm. I'm just looking for more comments. Rebecca, help me out if there's a lot of chat going on.
Yeah, there's so many good comments. I have copied and pasted them into an email, which I'll dutifully send along to our guests and to all of us so that we can think about them more, because it is really fascinating. And just your last comment makes me think that some of the theoretical perspectives may just need more time sort of in the bucket of philosophy, you know, sort of more logical testing. And that's okay, because we need that bucket, right? It's not that we want to get rid of it.
Well, I would say too, you know, the whole aspect about, science and the philosophy of science is something that is so critical. And I would recommend anybody who's interested in this area, if you go to the University of Minnesota, Paul Meehl's library of his works includes videos of his class on the philosophy of science. And they are absolutely priceless. And so I've watched them, and I've talked with Scott Lilienfeld a number of times, and he actually shared with me and said, well, I actually asked Dr. Meehl, and he sat in his class 3 times, because it was so informative. And a lot of the kinds of problems we are seeing today, things like the replication crisis, things like the pursuit of grants, pursuit of research because it's what the grant agencies will fund, rather than the pursuit of research that is actually informative or something that's really, really useful. That's a problem we're facing right now. And Paul Meehl talked about that back in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend those lectures for some just choice insights and where science comes from.
Great.
All right. I like you said, Rebecca, you got it all in an email, because I want to be mindful of time. Maybe we need to get to convince you for another episode.
Sure, I'd be happy to come back, and it could be part 2. CHC and issues revisited. And I suspect that when people see the PowerPoint or the slides and kind of go through there and start looking at it, they may have some specific questions. And if they do, those kinds of questions, if you guys are sort of collating those, it might be that there's some themes or things to address, and then maybe we can kind of come back another time and sort of share those or comments, and maybe some research will come out between now and then that maybe answers some things that I don't have data to comment on.
Very cool.
Okay, Psych Podcasters, you all have homework. Go over the slides, and I want 3 questions by part 2.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and even giving us some extra time after 8. Even we appreciate it. Really important stuff. My brain hurts a little bit. I'm gonna have to think through some of this and probably watch it to kind of fully understand some of this. But I think it's awesome. And yeah, and so our next episode, I think in 2 weeks, we're going to have Dr. McGrew on. So he's also going to be talking about updates to CHC Theory. So we might get a bit of a different perspective, and maybe we'll pass on some of the things that you mentioned here and see if he has comments on that.
Very good.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.